Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm back. We're going to continue the second part of this talk. Basically we're going to try to apply what we talked about in the first talk, a framework for evaluating audit effectiveness. We're going to try to apply that to a real audit or a real group of audits that happen on one protocol and see how it goes. So to frame this again, the question that we're trying to answer is, if a protocol receives multiple audits, which is the most effective? Which was the most effective? And this is not just on the same commit hash, this is across different commit hashes with different scopes, and kind of a situation where that we find more commonly, where you don't have an easy way to compare. So one kind of disclaimer for this talk is there's some approximations used. There isn't, when you're judging severities and doing different things, you can't always be exact. And so precision is great, but it doesn't necessarily mean if you don't have precision that there's no useful information that can be garnered from something. So to recap what we talked about in the last talk, there's kind of 5 different ways to work on evaluating audits across different commit hashes, different scopes, these kind of things. So the first one, to recap quickly, judge findings with a consistent severity standard. In this, we're going to use Sherlock's judging standard. We could use anyone else's judging standard, but that's what we're the most familiar with, and it also happens to be one of the more stringent in the space. If you talk to anyone who competes on Sherlock, it's very difficult. The criteria for getting a high, for getting a medium is very high. We evaluate audits in series, so these are audits that are happening at different points in time. We want to evaluate the shared contracts and scope only, because that's where the useful information will be. Shared NSLOC and scope, so if you change a contract, we want to check the diff of that contract to see which bugs could have been found based on the diff of one audit versus another. And then we make an assumption that every audit is kind of reasonably thorough. It's scoped well enough to where no audit can find anything, and that's a disclaimer that most auditors put in their audits, but they also do give protocol teams an exact number of weeks and whatnot to work with. So, and usually the protocol teams are able to accept that. So we're going to make that assumption. To recap, the effectiveness score, this is just a proposed way of evaluating the effectiveness of audits, and you can see that kind of last formula at the bottom. Vulnerabilities found over NSLOC audited, divided by vulnerabilities missed over the NSLOC overlap. The NSLOC overlap is basically how much opportunity was there after the audit to find more things by other auditors. So the higher effectiveness score, the better. And we did an example of it. I don't think we need to go back through that. And now we're going to take a look at this for Audit Finance and see kind of how these 6 audits fared. And the last audit that Sherlock did is not going to have a full kind of evaluation because there was no audit that happened after it. And I chose this one because Sherlock has done 2 audits in it. We're kind of in both positions, so whichever one ends up being worse is kind of hopefully where Sherlock bears the brunt of it. And then all these audit firms are some of the best in the space. So I thought it would be good to do a comparison with some really kind of top audit firms, and every audit firm that audited Agena is very well respected in the space. So first step is normalize the severity of the findings. So this is a list of the high severity findings found in each of those 6 audits according to the audit firm themselves. So Sherlock 11, TrailBits 1, QuantStamp 3, Prototech Labs 4, Codarena 11, Sherlock 6. This isn't going to be super meaningful yet, but this is the high or critical severity findings found in those audits according to those auditors. We're going to apply Sherlock's judging to that, and after we do that, we ended up downgrading 4 of those high/critical findings, 2 from Prototech, which were about rounding, and there was a great talk about rounding just now, but they didn't really show a clear attack vector for how the rounding issue could result in a critical vulnerability. And then there were 2 other findings that were kind of thrown out. One was a temporary denial of service, and the other one basically didn't seem like it actually, it may be more of a medium severity thing because you can't actually repeatedly go through the claiming cycle on different epochs. And by the way, I had a lot of help from Avert Kors at Sherlock and also HYH in evaluating some of these findings and trying to normalize the judging criteria and other things, so shout out to those two. Okay, so once we do that, we get to 2 findings for Prototech Labs, 2 high criticals, and 9 findings for Code Arena. Now, these findings are kind of normalized across severity. So these are all high findings according to Sherlock's judging criteria. We could have used any other judging criteria, so keep that in mind. And it might have been slightly different. So the next step is get the NSLOC in scope. This is fairly easy. So there was a main protocol in Ajna, and then there was kind of the grant coordination contracts. As you can see, we already have some problems here. QuantStamp didn't actually audit the main protocol. Prototech Labs didn't actually audit the grant coordination contracts. So this is already getting a little bit complex in terms of how we're going to evaluate the effectiveness of these different audits. Then we're going to count the missed vulnerabilities. This is the hardest part, and this is the part that is the most complex, requires the most time. You have to dig into different commit hashes of the same code base and try to understand, okay, was this vulnerability possible earlier on in a different commit hash? This is kind of the meat of the analysis here, and by far the thing that takes the most time. We can talk about different issues and whether someone believes that one issue was in scope or out of scope. These are kind of or missed or not missed based on those commit hashes. But this is kind of the hard part. So assuming that hopefully we get that right, by and large, approximately correct, we can move on to the 4th and final step, which is, okay, well, here the counting the missed vulnerabilities. So Sherlock, first audit missed 10, Trail of Bits missed 13, QuantStamp missed 1, Prototech Labs missed 13, Code Arena missed 0, and Sherlock number 2, they didn't have an auditor after it, so that should really be an NA. 4th step, measure the aggregate overlapping NSLOC. So we need to know which contracts were in scope or out of scope for these 6 different audits. And that's kind of what is being pictured here is, okay, let's figure out what was in scope, what was out of scope on the contract level. And then we can go ahead and actually do a diff of each contract and track, okay, how much of that contract was in scope, was in a shared scope between different audits that happened here. So you can see here, first column is how much NSLOC each one of these audited. You can see obviously subsequent audits. These are chronological. So Sherlock audit number 1 had 5 audits after it. The Trail of Bits audit had 4 audits after it. The aggregate NSLOC overlap in subsequent audits. This is effectively the surface area of, or the amount of eyeballs and kind of attention that was put on the same NSLOC by the preceding audit firms. So you can see maybe the QuantStamp audit is at 855 there. That's because, well, they only audited 560 NSLOC, but there was about 1.5 audits on roughly the same code base after that, 900 over 600 roughly. So this is really important to try to figure out, okay, let's quantify not only how many audits went after them, but what was in scope, like what was the amount of effort that went into finding vulnerabilities in that same NSLOC. All right, and now we can get to the effectiveness score. Again, this is just a proposed way of trying to figure out which audits were effective or ineffective based on different commit hashes. Happy to talk about feedback on different ways we can approach this, but I think this is an interesting one. It has some drawbacks, which we'll get into. But basically, so looking at it for Sherlock, audit number 1, we had 11 findings. We had 3,600 NSLOC was the scope that was looked at by Sherlock. And then 10 vulnerabilities, 10 high critical vulnerabilities were missed, and 14,500 NSLOC was kind of the amount of audits that happened afterwards on that same NSLOC that Sherlock audited. So, roughly like 4 times, it was audited roughly 4 times over after this first audit occurred. Okay, and now this is what it looks like if we evaluate every single audit firm on this effectiveness score. And so you can see here, Sherlock, we just talked about those numbers, the 11 high, 4,000 NSLOC, 10 highs missed, aggregate overlap of about 14,500. Trail of bits, 1 high found, 4,200 NSLOC audited, 13 highs missed, 11,500 NSLOC overlap. And for each of these, we're kind of running that same score to try to understand, okay, roughly how effective were these audits? And so you can see the numbers are pretty variable. The 1.6, we're kind of saying, okay, anything above 1 maybe is okay, but it's really relative. So if it's a 3 versus a 2, then the 3 is better than the 2. And for Code Arena, this is a little bit unfair to them actually because they didn't miss any highs, but they also had almost no NSLOC overlap. So they only had 1 audit afterwards, that Sherlock audit number 2, and very little of the Sherlock audit number 2 code overlapped with Code Arena. So that was a little bit of a tough one, but I would give them probably a lot of credit for finding 9 highs and having no highs missed, even though the NSLOC overlap was fairly low there. And then Sherlock audit number 2, you can't really evaluate that one. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of the meat of the analysis, and I think roughly it kind of makes sense if you look at it. Like, okay, if you're finding 1 high and you're missing 13 highs, that's kind of tough. That means there was a lot of things that kind of got through. 2 highs and 13 highs missed. That's pretty tough as well. I mean, Sherlock doesn't look great here on audit number 1, 11 highs found, 10 highs missed. But finding 11 highs is kind of what saved that effectiveness score. And the idea there is kind of like, okay, well, if you find a lot of highs in the audit, then maybe you didn't have time to find every single one. And so the effectiveness score should kind of reflect that, okay, if you find a lot of highs, then it's okay if you miss some because the scope, the amount of time you have is limited. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the meat of the analysis here. And I guess to move on to potential improvements to how to evaluate different auditors, different audits across commit hashes, I think one way to improve it would be including the reputation/effectiveness of subsequent auditors. So basically, if there's a lower quality auditor that goes after you, they're not going to find as many vulnerabilities, and it's going to make you look better. If a higher quality auditor goes after you, maybe they find a ton of vulnerabilities because they're very good, and then it's going to make you look worse if you audited right before them. So that's something that probably should be taken into account. And then giving extra credit to findings that others missed. So if you're an audit firm and you find 3 high severity vulnerabilities, but those are based on new scope that no one has ever looked at before, then that's cool. But it's a lot cooler if you find 3 high severity vulnerabilities on code that 3 auditors have looked at already. So, code that has been reviewed already. If you find findings that other audit firms missed, that's kind of higher signal than finding high severity vulnerabilities in code that no one has really looked at before. So those are some of the potential improvements. There's a few others. But yeah, the idea is hopefully we can move the space in a direction where we can quantify a little bit more kind of the effectiveness of different audits and see over time, which auditors are really delivering a lot of value to protocol teams and which auditors are delivering less value. And that's it.